What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Facts on the Ground. I'm Misty Winston, joined by my co-host, Jesse Zerowell. Today, we have a very special guest who is the author of the new book, Enough Already. And he is one of our, in my opinion, one of our best foreign policy voices. And I enjoy his show and his books and his works. He's also on antiwar.com. You should definitely check him out there. So Scott Horton, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Happy to be here. How are you guys doing?
Doing very well. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
So there's so much that we could talk to you about, that, we could have, a whole series of shows because, we like to focus on foreign policy. We're, it's kind of our little niche sometimes. But your book that you have now called Enough Already is it kind of takes the war on terror, the quote unquote war on terror, really back to its roots, which I think a lot of people, we didn't really hear that phrase until, 9/11 and all of that. So can you kind of just give us like I guess like a brief rundown? I know it's a ridiculous ask, like give us 40 years of history in, a short answer, but in your opinion, when did the war on terror really start?
Well, yeah, it all goes back to 79. That's the magic kind of number here, I guess. And I'll try to do it as fast as I can.
Take your time, but
yeah. All right. Well, so basically, the first thing that happened 79 is the Iranian Revolution, end of 78, beginning of 79. And importantly, I guess, I don't know. You decide if this is a tangent or not. But the CIA and the State Department told the Carter government that we like the Ayatollah Khomeini. He's fine. He helped us with, the agitation against Mossadegh when we overthrew him back in 1953, because the CIA had overthrown the democratically elected prime minister of the country back in 1953 and had reinstalled the Shah. And so they said, we know this guy. He's fine. And so the Carter government told the French to go ahead and let him get on the plane and go home and inherit the revolution. And
because he was in exile in Paris.
That's right. Yeah, he was living in France at the time. So I was just a kid. I learned all about this later. But even adults who lived through all of this, if you go back and ask them, they conflate it all together, the hostage crisis with the revolution. But the hostage crisis wasn't till the end of 79, November 79, after Carter invited the Shah into the country for cancer treatment. And that was what caused the riot among the students and the seizure of the hostages at the embassy. And then, Nightline was founded, and Ted Koppel, sold the American people on Islamic fundamentalism. They call us the Great Satan and burn our flag, and they hate us. But without the backstory that, well, they're overthrowing a dictatorship that we'd foisted on them 25 years ago after they had gotten rid of it. And we had reinstalled it for them, that part was left out. That became the basis of, all this enmity between the United States and Iran ever since then, really. And then now that summer, the Carter government in July embarked on a policy to fund the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Now, the purpose of that was to try to bait the Soviets into invading, to give them their own Vietnam War, as they said at the time. And the Soviets did invade in December, but it wasn't really in reaction to the provocation by the CIA. They were going to invade anyway. They needed to. And the first thing they did was take their dictator, puppet out back and shoot him in the head and replace him with a new guy because of what a lousy job he was doing. But it doesn't matter because the point's still the same. That's what the Americans were trying to do, was bait the Soviets into invading. So they did invade Christmas 79. Then once they did, the Carter government panicked and said, oh no, our plot succeeded. And now the Soviets have invaded Afghanistan and we have this weakened revolutionary Iran. And so in effect, they were giving a war guarantee to Iran, who they, hated by that time since, last month, right? But they were afraid that the Russians were going to invade Iran and take it over. And then that would lead them to be able to dominate the Persian Gulf, and they could go around the mountains and seize the port of Karachi from Pakistan and vastly expand their power. And so Carter announced in January of 1980 the Carter Doctrine. In response to this catastrophic success of his policy, as W. Bush would say, he announced the Carter Doctrine that says the Persian Gulf belongs to us. And they started, and essentially it's an American lake any other power, read the USSR, tries to dominate it, meaning invade Iran, then we will go to war with you. We'll treat that as an attack on the United States, basically the same way, the same war guarantee we'd given to West Germany, right? As
the
part of that, they
Russians-
started. I'm sorry.
Just to add some context to this, had the Russians expressed any interest in invading Iran? Had they said anything to that extent?
You know, I think there may have been some indications that they were considering it. You know, this has been characterized different ways as an overreaction by the Carter people, but also that I've also read it, you know, that they really thought that there was a problem there, that the Soviets, once they had invaded Afghanistan, that they thought, oh, geez, it's just a little further to the ocean, you know, that kind of deal, or a little bit further. And Iran was so weak at the time under the new revolutionary government that it would have been easy enough for them to topple. So they must have been considering it. I'd have to go back. Two great books on this whole era are Devil's Game with Robert Dreyfuss, by Robert Dreyfuss, how the U.S. Helped unleash fundamentalist Islam. And really, especially got to read this one, is Treacherous Alliance by Trita Parsi. And this was his PhD thesis that then he turned into a full-fledged book that is really incredible. It tells, you know, the inside story of all this stuff. Treacherous Alliance, it's called. The secret dealings of America, Israel, and Iran, with the poor Iraqis stuck in the middle the whole time. And yeah, speaking of the Iraqis, so part of the Carter Doctrine was building up the Gulf bases, but then also giving Saddam Hussein, the new dictator of Iraq, who had just overthrown his partner and taken over the country in that same year in 79. And Carter gave him the green light to invade Iran. The reason Saddam wanted to do that was because he was sitting on essentially a 20% minority Sunni Arab run dictatorship, although the Baath party was mixed. It was dominated by the Sunni tribes there, lording it over a 60% super majority Shiite Arab population. So if you look at the map of Baghdad or the map of Iraq in your head, from Baghdad all the way down to Kuwait and all the way over to Iran is all predominantly Shiite territory. The Sunnis are dominant in the west, and of course the Kurds in the far north of the country up there in the mountains, and they're Sunnis, but they're Kurds, not Arabs. And in all these dealings we're talking about here, they were mostly allied with the Shiites, not the Sunni Arabs. But anyway, Saddam had a real problem. He was afraid that these Shiite Arabs of southeastern Iraq, that they would choose their religious sect over their national and ethnic sect as Iraqis and Arabs, and that the Shiite revolution would take predominance, in their mind, which was true for many of them. And a bunch of Iraqis had started going over to Iran, and a bunch of Shiite Iraqis started talking about bringing the revolution into Iraq. So Saddam's solution to this was to conscript them all and send them off to war to fight and die trying to invade and topple the new fundamentalist government in Iran.
And he thought it was going to be, in his words, a whirlwind war that was not going to last 8 years as it did.
Oh, yeah, no, it was supposed to be easy. Absolutely. And in fact, I interviewed a State Department guy named Wayne White one time, who was, in the State Department at the time, and how the idea was he's going to march right in there and kick the Ayatollah right out of power. And of course, the should be famous saying of Randolph Bourne from 100 years ago in his great anarchist essay, "War is the health of the state." And of course, that's if you don't lose and get completely destroyed by your enemy. But otherwise, it was in the Ayatollah's benefit to be invaded by the, infidel Saddam Hussein, because the people of Iran, basically, they're stuck with whatever security force they've got in the capital city at any given time. And when confronted with a foreign adversary, they'll rally around him. Just like, Americans rallied around George W. Bush, of all people, after we were attacked. It's, in fact, at Georgetown University, they call it the rally around the flag effect. It's no surprise. That's exactly what people are going to do. And so this helped to solidify the Ayatollah's power. Now, Reagan comes in. Reagan continues both of these policies, backing Saddam Hussein against Iran, including with chemical weapons, paying for him to buy chemical weapons from the British and the Germans and the French, I guess, and then using American satellites to target Iranian troops in the field with them, which with sarin and Tabun nerve gas and the worst chemical warfare since, the First World War. And then also supporting not just the Arab Afghan army, but supporting the, I'm sorry, I meant to say not just the Afghan Mujahideen, but the Arab Afghan army, the international Islamic brigades of people from all over the world, even the United States and the Philippines and Chechnya, but especially the Arab world, who all went to Afghanistan to fight as extras in Rambo 3. I mean, to fight against the Soviet Union in that war, and then, as told in Rambo 3. And so then, this, of course, the Azam group, which was, one of the Arab groups that fought there, eventually grew into bin Laden's organization, Al-Qaeda, and merged with Egyptian Islamic Jihad, the leaders of which had earned their credibility as fighters in the same war in Afghanistan. So then at the end of the 1980s, Saddam Hussein has a dispute with Kuwait and UAE and Saudi too over war debts. And the Kuwaitis especially were being harsh and calling in all their loans. And at that time, oil was trading at like $10 a barrel or something like that. So Hussein could not really rebuild his country whatsoever, much less pay back all these war debts. And the way he looked at it, he had fought that war on their behalf anyway. And so they ought to cut him some slack, And
Yeah,
that insults injury.
He also tried to leverage the argument that Kuwait was in fact the 18th province of Iraq.
Well, that was kind of, I think that was the after the fact justification, that they
Right.
kind of came up with. At the time, the argument was that the Kuwaitis were overproducing from their shared oil wells on the Rumelia oil field. And, basically West Texas rules are go ahead and break their knees then if that's what they're doing. You got a shared well and your neighbor's overproducing, breaking the contract. Well, you take care of that. So James Baker's State Department essentially let Hussein know that we don't give a damn if you take the northern oil fields. At the same time, the CIA and Central Command were telling the Kuwaitis to tell Saddam Hussein, to go to hell essentially, and to be, completely intransigent. And then the Defense Department back home, Wolfowitz and Cheney, they were trying to stop him. And they were like sending memos and trying to get, I think Wolfowitz especially was panicking and saw what was happening and was trying to get Hussein to back down. And they had H.W. Bush send a letter. This is supposed to be the short version. I know, I'm sorry. They had H.W. Bush send a letter to Hussein to encourage him to not do it. But then they decided, man, that wasn't worded strongly enough. We better send another one. But by then it was too late. The tanks were already rolling. And then not only did he take the northern oil fields, he took the whole country. Now, that night, August 2nd, 1990, the Bush National Security Cabinet, which was Cheney and Colin Powell, and Brent Scowcroft was the National Security Advisor. Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Cheney, Secretary of Defense, and I guess Bush himself. They all decided that we're drawing the line at Saudi Arabia. We don't care if Saddam invaded and took Kuwait. And we did kind of tell him to do it. So what the hell, right? But then the next day, Bush met with Margaret Thatcher. And she accused him, I guess, within earshot of reporters. Don't you go wobbly on me now, Bush, at this Aspen conference that they were at. And then she had her people leak it to the, I guess it came later that they said they gave Bush a backbone transplant. And what happened was after she, basically accused him of a lack of manhood, then he said, oh, yeah, well, this will not stand. And we're going to do something about this now. And really was for British interests, right? Because the British were heavily invested in Kuwaiti oil, and the Kuwaiti royal family was heavily invested in British government debt. And so this is essentially, we're just, carrying water, the USA carrying water for Margaret Thatcher's former empire there, over there, when the Bush government, they clearly didn't care. I mean, James Baker had told them, go ahead, essentially giving them the flashing yellow light to do it. So it took them some encouragement to actually betray their old friend, but then they did. And then they spent through the rest of 1990, they refused to negotiate. And they had all different chances to negotiate. Chomsky was the best on tracking them all, but there's more besides that. Murray Wass at New York Newsday did a bunch of great work on this and all this about how Hussein was desperate to negotiate and just wanted slight face-saving measures, and they wouldn't give them because they wanted their war by that time. So I'm going somewhere with this, I promise. The thing is
this is great. Take your time.
So once they do Iraq War I, Desert Storm, they called it, right? It's short and sweet war. We bombed them for a few weeks from the air, and then the 100-hour ground war, and our space age technology went in there and beat the crap out of this old Soviet supplied army, and it was great. And that's all you need to know. Except that we've been bombing them for 30 years ever since then. So
yeah, I also just want to ask if you can talk about Saudi Arabia's place in this, because during the first Gulf War, the U.S. military was stationed in Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden later cited that as part of the reason he wanted
We're
to
getting
wage.
to that presently.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's
and
coming
Saudi
up,
Arabia
subject after next.
And Saudi Arabia also had a large part in what happened in Afghanistan, matching the U.S. essentially dollar for dollar in their funding.
In backing the rise of the Taliban? Oh, or you mean back in the 80s, back in the Mujahideen?
The Mujahideen, yeah.
All right, so here's how it goes. After Iraq War I, the Bush senior government encouraged an uprising among the supermajority Shiite population of Iraq and the Kurds. And Bush announced over Radio Free America or whatever the hell it is. On the tip of my tongue there, I just lost it. But had them announce over the radio, or he personally made a statement on the radio, and then they dropped leaflets over all of the army divisions, encouraging them to rise up. And they did. But then they changed their mind. And General Schwarzkopf, was told to let Hussein keep enough tanks and helicopters to win. And he did. And Hussein crushed the uprising, and he killed 100,000 people or so in crushing that uprising. So the question is, if the Bush people didn't want to go all the way to Baghdad because they had this big coalition and they couldn't break it up by expanding the war and all that, but then they encouraged this uprising and the people went to rise up and overthrow the evil Hitler, Saddam Hussein, why did they betray them? Why did they encourage it and then betray them? And the answer was because they realized that they were now importing the Iranian Revolution, the same one that they had just spent a decade supporting Saddam Hussein to contain. And that this Shiite uprising was going to be a fundamentalist Ayatollah-led Iranian Revolution style uprising. And that in fact, they recognized that Iraqis that had taken Iran's side in the Iran-Iraq war were coming across the border to lead the thing, namely the Badr Brigade. So they panicked and they said, okay, now we have to call it off. And, we won't support Saddam anymore, but better him there than the Ayatollah's men taking over. So that was why they betrayed the uprising. But then that became their excuse to stay in Saudi Arabia. Dick Cheney personally had promised the king, as soon as the war's over, we'll get right back out again. But then this meant, nope, we have to stay to protect the Shiites and the Kurds who were, crushed in the uprising. Now, the thing is here is this is nonsense, right? Because the uprising had already been crushed. It's not like Hussein is just going to kill every last man, woman, and child in Iraqi Shiistan there, or whatever the supermajority population of the country. And it's not like if America stopped patrolling the no-fly zones, that the Shiites were just going to jump right back up into insurgency to be crushed again. I mean, the insurgency was crushed. The status quo was going to hold no matter what. But what happened was, and I know this is a long version, I'm sorry, guys, but
we need the long version.
Yeah.
So a major part of what happened was that the Israelis were complaining that now that you bomb the hell out of Iraq, Saddam is not strong enough to contain Iran. Now we insist you stay in Saudi to contain Iraq and Iran. And it was their policy. The dual containment policy was born in Tel Aviv. And it was Martin Indyk, who worked for Bill Clinton, who had formerly worked for Yitzhak Shamir, the Israeli prime minister. And he came to work for Bill Clinton, and he insisted on this policy. And Clinton was resistant to it because In fact, he had said even during the campaign, he should have kept his mouth shut about this. But he said something in the campaign of like, yeah, maybe we'll look at normalizing relations with Hussein's regime again soon. Well, there are a lot of people didn't want to hear that. And then you had the reformers were being elected. You know, the old, mean, old, scary Ayatollah with the big dark circles around his eyes had died in 89. Now you have the same guy we have now. Khamenei came to power after that. And then I forgot, I'm sorry, what years Khatami and Rafsanjani, I think Rafsanjani was first. I'm sorry, I forgot what year he was originally elected. But the idea was maybe, you know, it's been 10 years since the revolution and the hostage crisis and all that. Maybe we can begin to, you know, normalize relations with Iran. And the Israelis were insisting, rather than normalize relations with both, how about normalize relations with neither and keep the Cold War with both of them up, you know, from now on, from bases in Saudi. And so that was really the policy. And Clinton adopted it after the giant fake assassination attempt against George H.W. Bush, which never even happened. That was supposedly an Iraqi attempt to murder H.W. Bush in Kuwait. And then, but once that hoax, it was perpetrated by the Kuwaitis. I don't think the Israelis had anything to do with it. But once that happened, Clinton went ahead and gave in, and Indyk announced the dual containment policy. And so then that meant, you know, bombing and blockading Iraq for the rest of the 1990s, for the rest of the 20th century. That essentially there can be no peace here. They're on a pretended snipe hunt for all these weapons of mass destruction, which all have been destroyed by the end of 1991. And they knew that for an absolute certainty by 1995, when Hussein's son-in-law, Hussein Kamel, defected to Jordan and spilled his entire guts to the IAEA and all of the UN inspectors and the CIA and the MI6 and even CNN. You can go read his interview on CNN, which I watched live at the time. I remember him spilling his whole guts about how I destroyed every last bit of it. I swear to God. And he brought all his paperwork with him. And after that, Hussein ordered his government to give every scrap of paper they had to the UN, because he was terrified he was going to get caught with something that he didn't even know he had, and that he had ordered people to give up already. But we want to come all the way clean. And that was the same info that basically showed up as the 12,000 page dossier screaming not guilty in 2002 that he gave to the UN, saying, see, I don't have anything, that they took as proof that, see, he's not admitting he has anything. Yeah, because he's admitting that he doesn't have anything. That's right. All. That was the truth, and they knew it was the truth. But anyway, but that became the excuse for this containment policy, especially against Iraq. And then this became the primary motivating factor for bin Laden and his Arab Afghan Mujahideen from the Afghan war that the Americans, and as you say, the Saudis and the Pakistanis had supported for all those years, to then turn against the United States. And if you read the statements, so if you start with the very early Al-Qaeda attacks on America, bin Laden is just kind of barely affiliated. Mm-hmm. You know, this is like at the beginning, this is proto Al-Qaeda, when it's really Egyptian Islamic Jihad is really based in New York, but bin Laden's group is kind of tied to them and paying for their legal fees and this kind of thing. So it's all, their groups are coming together to become Al-Qaeda really at this time. But it attacked us all through the 1990s. The first one, how subtle is this? Their first attack was the assassination of a right-wing nationalist Israeli rabbi, an American actually, but a rabbi who named Rabbi Kahane, from the Koch party, the right-wing fascist party that was outlawed by the Israeli Supreme Court for being fascist. No shit. And he advocated the complete expulsion of all Palestinians from all of historic Palestine. And he was assassinated in 1990. And then there was the World Trade Center bombing, the first one, and which, yes, the FBI could have stopped it, but Google me and that, and you'll find out more about that. And then a bombing of the National Guard training facility in Saudi Arabia in 95, the Khobar Towers attack in 96, which the Clinton government went along with the Saudis and blaming that on Iran, and Iranian-backed Saudi Hezbollah, which is some tiny group if they exist at all, and certainly did not do it. It was Al-Qaeda, bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed who did it. Ramzi Youssef's uncle, the World Trade Center bomber's uncle, and the guy that ended up, you know, heavily involved in 9/11 later on. Who did that, and who they kill. They killed 19 American airmen at their base in Saudi Arabia, where they were stationed there to bomb the people of Iraq. Then there was, of course, the African embassy bombings and the USS Cole and culminating in September 11th here. So now the point here is Al-Qaeda is at war against the United States, but what's the point of these attacks? First of all, they said repeatedly, and including the statements to the Western press. You can go look up bin Laden's interviews with CNN and ABC News and with Robert Fisk from The Independent and Abdel Bari Atwan, who's a journalist from London, where they explain all of this stuff all before September 11th. In fact,
Yeah, and you read about
ahead.
this in your most recent piece at antiwar.com about how Peter Bergen is getting it wrong. So maybe you
right,
can...
and you can watch that interview there, and they don't talk about they hate our freedom in there at all. The whole controversy is about our bases in Saudi, period. And that's and Israel, support for Israel.
I was going to ask if maybe you can tie that into what you're talking about right now.
Yeah. Well, okay, so I'll get right to that in just a second.
Sure.
So first of all is the motive. The motive is the troops in Saudi to bomb Iraq, support for Israel in their violence against Palestinians and Lebanese, then support for the dictators of the region, especially the king of Saudi Arabia and the El Presidente of Egypt, Mubarak, then pressure on all the kingdoms to keep oil prices artificially low, production high, and prices low to subsidize our economy at their expense, and turning a blind eye to Russia, China, India, and Uzbekistan in their violence against Muslims. And so that was the recruiting pitch. That was what bin Laden said over and over again to recruit people into his movement that got them to do it. It wasn't God says that we hate mini skirts, and so let's go knock down some towers, right? That just never had anything to do with it. It was always about, they hated Bill Clinton and his policies, as we all did, just more. And so that was the motive. But then, so here's the strategy. The strategy was to provoke an overreaction and to essentially give the American government an excuse, a crisis to exploit, in order to expand the American empire, to overexpand it, to get it to destroy itself. It's the only way to do it, really. And as Saul Alinsky said, in asymmetric political actions, including terrorism, which that's my parentheses, including terrorism, but in all asymmetric political actions, the true action is in the reaction of the opposition. And so, how do we get the Americans to ruin their own empire so that they'll eventually leave us alone for real? And obviously setting off a few truck bombs here and there isn't getting the job done. What we need is to bait them into fully invading Afghanistan. And then we will bog them down, kill their guys, demoralize their military, and waste their money, break their empire. We'll drive them out the same way that we did with the Russians, the same way that America had helped them do to the Russians. Now, so my article that you're referring to, it's my last article for antiwar.com. Just go to antiwar.com/Scott. It'll come right up there. It's about how Peter Bergen, who was the producer for Peter Arnett, who interviewed Osama bin Laden in 1996 and is a terrorism expert and has written a bunch of books about it and is on CNN all the time and stuff. There was a clip of him recently saying that the, bleed us to bankruptcy strategy, that there's no evidence that that was what bin Laden was ever really trying to do, that he made that up in 2004 to justify his failure. Because what he said was we were a paper tiger and we'd turn and run away. And so then in 2004, after the fact, when, not only have we invaded Afghanistan, but we spread our military empire throughout the region and invaded Iraq and all these things that, made a fool out of him and shown him just what a paper tiger we're not. Only then did he adopt this thing about, oh, yeah, no, but that's what I was trying to get you to do. But the thing is, so I wrote this article about how that's just not true. And there are statements where bin Laden says that America is a paper tiger, but he says this directly to the faces of Western reporters. And so you got to give it at least a 50% chance, right? That he's jerking your chain, man. He's saying, look, I know that I could beat you with a couple of open slaps to your face and that you'll turn around and run home to your mama. Well, doesn't that sound like a taunt? right?
Yes.
Rather than just a simple description of his, observations. He's, in fact, in the one I quote in the article, he was saying, these guys call themselves the kings of the New World Order, but then they realize that they are not fit for such titles. They're far too small and weak of men for names like that. I mean, come on. He's jerking your chain. He's trying to get you mad and do something stupid, obviously. John Miller later, who was the ABC News reporter who interviewed him, told Peter Bergen later on that, yeah, when I interviewed him and he told me he's going to take on the USA superpower, I'm thinking to myself, yeah, you in what army, pal? Of course, he didn't say that, but yeah, you in what army? But the joke is, well, John Miller and Peter Bergen and CNN and the US Army. That's all the army that bin Laden needs, right? Is for these guys to not understand. And then for those guys to do killing based on what these guys say the deal is, and if you go back to the dawn of the terror war, you'll find over and over again, Jonah Goldberg in the National Review, they say we're a paper tiger. You know what that means? We got to go big and go large, and stay forever and never leave anywhere ever. And you can find that everybody just repeating this throughout the last 20 years, including just 6 weeks ago now or so, Brett Stevens in the New York Times said, yes, he said we're a paper tiger. We can never leave Afghanistan. We're proving that they're right about us, that we will not commit to a century of war or whatever it is.
Well, the flaws in that argument there are two at least. The first one being that bin Laden never gave a timeline of any sort for how for the baiting and then actions against the US. He never said that it was going to take a year or 5 years or 10 years. And that's something that Peter Bergen, for example, doesn't address in his statements.
Yeah.
And then there's also, the fact that look at how the US is leaving Afghanistan. It's leaving as not just a paper tiger, right? But leaving, and we can get into that. But insofar as it is leaving, it's not just a paper tiger, but it's been through a paper shredder multiple times at this point. So, Bergen has that statement you point out in your piece that bin Laden's making an excuse for his failure, a post facto judgment of his failure. And it's the naivety in the naivete, however you want to pronounce it, in those arguments is not befitting somebody who calls himself a terrorism expert. And it seems more like there's ideology driving his statements as opposed to material fact.
Yeah, or just, I think maybe he was one of the taunted and didn't realize it, and now he's kind of got to admit that he got played. But here's the cut to the chase of that, is that I got a quote from Abdel Bari Atwan from 1996 when bin Laden explained to him that this is what he wanted to do. And then I have a quote from Ayman al-Zawahiri saying they want to draw us into the heart of the Arab and Muslim world for a massive conflict. And then I'm missing one off the top of my head. I'm sorry, but the best one is from bin Laden's son, Omar, who's not a terrorist, who gave an interview to Rolling Stone in 2010, where he says, when Bush was elected in 2000, my father was so happy. This is the kind of president he needs, one who will attack and spend money and break the country, right? So this is the kind of thing where it's out of the mouths of babes here, right? Like, this guy didn't read this in Michael Scheuer's book and then figure out a way to pretend that was a story about his father or something. This was what he clearly had learned from Osama bin Laden himself. He says, my father wanted to do exactly to the Americans what he had done to the Russians and force them out, whatever, the long way, the hard way. In Clinton's time, when they sent some missiles, they missed my father, but you've been in Afghanistan now for 10 years, he said, and you still don't have him. This was 2010. Better you'd have kept that money for your economy. In Clinton's time, your government was very smart, not like the bull that runs after the red scarf. So, know,
and it
pretty
is very
good. And
interesting that
there's more like that.
we helped, you know, drag Russia into that situation.
Right. That was
And
the purpose of it.
right.
That's exactly right.
But we don't recognize it when it's happening to us. It's
exactly right. Like, yeah, no, this was, I know what we'll do. We'll give them their own Vietnam back in 79 when it's Zbigniew Brzezinski hatching the plot. Then when we're replaying the same thing in the role of the Soviets who were playing the role of us in Vietnam, no, that has nothing to do with this.
they
No,
hate
I
us
don't
for
know
our
what you're talking about.
freedoms.
Yeah, no. But so that was the strategy, right? Was to bait us into this massive overreaction. Now, the thing of it is, you know, I argue this in both books, but, you know, especially the Afghanistan book, Fool's Errand. First of all, they could have negotiated for extradition and tried these guys in court. That'd have been it. They didn't want to negotiate. They wanted a war.
It was offered. They offered to give bin Laden up.
That's absolutely right. And I go through and I explain, you know, each of the steps of that, where the Bush people refused to negotiate. And then, but even if you said, well, you know what? I don't want to negotiate. I want to bomb Al Qaeda to death, man. Screw those guys. They knock our towers down. They're going to have to, I'll give them a court of F-16 fighters. I would say to you, you know what? Fine. Actually, I don't care if you bomb these guys to death at, you know, out there at Tora Bora, where they're hiding. There's no civilians or collateral damage to be had anywhere around, only the guilty and their fellow travelers. Go ahead and bomb the hell out of them for all I care. For the sake of argument, I'm not going to argue with you about it, okay? But you still don't have to bomb the Taliban. You don't have to take the fight to the Taliban at all. They could have dropped all the paratroopers right on the Lion's Den hideout there in Tora Bora, Nangar province, where they knew good and well that was, you know, a vast likelihood of where bin Laden would have been in the first place. And then that's it. But then you might say, not good enough, Horton, because I'm so mad at the Taliban for even allowing bin Laden to live in Afghanistan since 1996 that I still want to bomb them just because it's only, you know, October the 10th and I'm still mad. It's only been a month and, you know, okay, fine. So say you want to bomb the Taliban. You still have to do a full-scale alliance with the Northern Alliance and send in all your special operations forces to help them win the war and overthrow the government in Kabul and launch this regime change in the capital city. But even then, even if you said, fine, no, we want to see the Northern Alliance come in and kick the Taliban out of the capital. Okay. For the sake of argument, I guess everybody's still mad. It's not even Christmas 2001 yet. So whatever, you're emotional. I'm not going to fight with you about that, maybe for the sake of argument now. But now what do? Create a new government in Kabul and swear to defend it against all of its rivals from now unto eternity. And the government is made up of a coalition of people that the population had actually been happy to see the Taliban overthrow from power when Clinton helped them just a few years before. You know, the warlords and the Mujahideen, most of these guys had fought against the Soviet Union. Some of them, like General Dostum, had fought for them. Massoud had been a double agent, but he was already dead. But most of these guys were the warlords who were the Mujahideen who had fought for the CIA and against the Soviet Union, people like Haqqani and Hekmatyar. And the Taliban had come to power really to drive them out because they were so destructive. And the Taliban brought law and order, and they were supported by the Bill Clinton government along with the Saudis and the Pakistanis to come because they wanted to build an oil pipeline from Turkmenistan to the port of Karachi. And
that would be
so,
Unocal.
Yeah, which was never going to happen anyway. But they got it in their head that if they could help the Taliban win a total victory over the Northern Alliance, the Taliban could provide enough security that they could build this pipeline to what? This is all goes back to the Cold War, right? We're still trying to keep the Russians from taking the gas out of the and oil out of the Caspian Basin and figure out a way to pump it south just to screw them out of a few nickels or whatever it's worth there. You know, nothing for all this trouble, you know, forget it. But anyway, so that was part of why the Clinton government had supported the rise of the Taliban in the first place there. And just as we've seen this week, and I know we'll get back to this, but when the Taliban came into Kabul in 96, they were welcomed by the people, even though there's hardly a Pashtun in sight. I mean, these guys are hillbillies from the far side of Pashtunistan who are, their kind of people are not represented in the population of the capital city at all. They walked right into cheering throngs because these guys, as religious authorities, they're extremely authoritarian and brutal in their implementation of Sharia law and all that, but they enforce the law, which is different still from rampant criminality and drug dealing and murder and rape and kidnapping rings and just, total just warlordism run amok, which is the way it had been previously. So that's part of why they were welcomed into Kabul just in the last week here too.
Well, I think also it's like it's the fighting back against empire. I don't think any population wants to be, overthrown and controlled by a foreign government.
That's absolutely right. It's independence first, and then you fight about everything else. Same thing with why would anybody support Castro? Kept the Yankees out. That's reason number one. Why would anybody support Maduro now? Is because he is clearly independent from the United States of America, and that's value one. Think if it was the other way around, and we were arguing about which politician is independent of the domination of Venezuela. That's the one we would support, right? It's simple as that. Yeah. Same as anything. So you're absolutely right there.
What often gets skewed about the Taliban, especially of late, is that they're presented as a theocratic force, solely a theocratic force, and not an indigenous, nationalist, arguably resistance force, which is what they are in reality. But we get the narrative that they're solely a theocratic force that wants to put the whole country under Sharia law and just
all that's
put
true
the crack
too.
down.
Oh, that's true too. I mean, it's sort of like
right.
if, Pat Robertson and the fundamentalist Christians were leading the insurgency against foreigners here. That we're not going back to the Declaration of Independence after this. We're going to Falwell land now, whatever it is.
Right.
But there is a lot to that. But but you're right though. Why would anybody support them? It's the same thing with Bin Laden. Why would anybody agree with Bin Laden? It wasn't because he was saying kill them because they're free and decadent. It's because he was saying kill them because they're killing you.
Yes.
Kill them because they're killing your people. And that's the kind of thing that motivates people to fight, obviously. So, and the Taliban has, and we're skipping ahead in the story here, but they've clearly bitten off a lot here. We'll see if they can chew it all. Even their new Baradar, the guy who's at least nominally in charge now, said, hey, we didn't think that this was going to be that easy or happen that quickly. So everybody, we should just pray and act real cool for now and see what happens and
go to the gym, ride the merry-go-round.
Yeah, that's right. Go play on the swing set for a little while and get, the let out a little bit, relax. Anyways, so listen, so that was the whole deal was, and here's my other major piece of evidence that I forgot to say was, Bin Laden wrote a letter to Mullah Omar that Alan Cullison from the Wall Street Journal got his hands on the computer and salvaged the stuff off of the hard drive there. And and you can read it in the text of the thing is all block quoted at The Atlantic. And I linked to it in my piece at antiwar.com. And what it is it's a letter from Bin Laden, and he's basically sucking up to Mullah Omar, saying, you're so brave for not handing me over. Man, boy, do I respect you a lot for not giving me up after all this trouble I've gotten you into, basically, right? So he says, listen, you got to understand the Americans, we've got them stuck now in this terrible position where if they withdraw now, then they'll be regarded as a second-rate world power, just like Russia is. Because everyone will see how weak they are. But if they commit to a major mission, then I forgot exactly how he says it, but essentially, then we'll bog them down, we'll break them the hard way, and we'll send them home. I think he does give a time frame, actually. I think he says something like, just give it another 10 years, and all this collateral damage notwithstanding, that then we'll get what we want and the Americans will go home. And then he makes the direct comparison to the Soviet Union. And then their empire will be completely broken like the Soviet Union was after we did it to them back, 10 years.
And I hate to say it, he's right. I mean, that's how empires fall. They overextend themselves militarily. That's right. Everybody knows that. amazing
You
that
would
we've
think
managed
so.
to fall for it. Yeah,
Yep.
it's amazing that it's not amazing because the people in charge are, you know, not
Yeah.
great people. And it's like, we're controlled by a bunch of psychopathic meatheads, basically.
Yep. Yale and Harvard, they're not sending their best.
Yeah.
You know,
So true. So true.
Listen, I mean, so right after September 11th, so this is, why I was a New World Order kook. Exactly what you just said. All empires fall. This is why I was a New World Order kook in the 1990s. Is I said, listen, everybody knows all empires fall, and the more reckless you are about it, the quicker you're going to fall. And so if I know that, and I'm a stupid skateboarder cab driver kid in Austin, Texas, then that means that all these rulers of the universe up there in New York City and in Washington, D.C., they all know this too.
Yeah.
It must be all a treasonous plot. They're doing this on purpose. And it's all because of the evil Skull and Bones secret handshake or whatever it is, a plot for one world government under the UN later, where the US essentially must be subsumed under this larger global empire. But
And
that was
Bush,
completely stupid and wrong. That's not what was happening. But the
Bush
thing
Senior
is,
did use the term New World Order in one
well,
of his.
yeah, but that's not what he meant. That's not what he meant.
Right.
He just meant the American empire. But the point is that the reason that the kind of John Bircher conspiracy theory that they were really truly trying to build a one world government that would rule over America as well was just because of how obvious it is, which you just said. All empires fall.
Mhm.
The famous conspiracy theory Bible, Tragedy and Hope. That's actually what that title means, is all empires commit suicide. And that's the tragedy. And the hope is that we can learn from history and make the right choices and be, as H.W. Bush would say and not do, be prudent and reserve your power and try to preserve your republic by applying the lessons of history and not giving it all away. And instead, of course, what do? We go straight for tragedy, screw hope.
Which is incredibly frustrating. And I get that. I mean, I'm a press freedom and free speech activist, so I talk about this all the time. The propaganda level in this country, really around the world, but this country has really got it down to an art. Like it's like fine tuned. They're very good at pushing a narrative. We've talked about it on the show before. The reason why we keep continuing to, be led into these ridiculous wars is because our media, you've spoken about it here today. Our media is just like constantly churning out this war propaganda, and they just convince people over and over and over again that these are things that we should be doing. And I don't know if we're ever going to, it's depressing, but I don't know if we're ever going to be able to overcome that kind of mentality. It's really troubling, to say the least.
I mean, I think we're going to have the Afghanistan syndrome now.
Mm-hmm.
After, here's the thing about it, right? Like, even your goofball neighbor who doesn't think about this stuff very often, right? If he thinks about it at all, he's got to know that, like, wow. So after 20 years and all that hype may be equivalent to all the hype that had ever been blown in the history of the world. It turns out we lost both those wars and they were all for nothing.
Yeah.
And that we didn't even actually lose anything because it doesn't even matter who rules Afghanistan as far as America's national interest is concerned anyway. Yeah. Where
all those lives, all that money gone for nothing, literally for nothing.
Right. So this was the step I skipped at the very beginning of this. Why do they do this? Why do they want to bait the Soviets into overexpansion in Afghanistan anyway? Give them their own Vietnam. I thought the policy was containment. The answer to that is the American people had the Vietnam syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
That was this mental illness of a reluctance to want to go to war. That's what our government considered it. And they complained over and over again about this terrible Vietnam syndrome. Mm-hmm. And so Brzezinski and them were being clever and saying, well, if we can't contain them because the American people don't have the will to keep containing them, maybe we'll bait them into overexpansion. Maybe we'll have to figure out something else that we can do to screw them over. So instead of hemming them in, let's go ahead and encourage them to overcommit to responsibilities that they can't afford. Worth a try. And that's kind of where this came from in the first place. And if Vietnam was that bad for us, it'll be that bad for them.
Yes.
I'm sorry, go
ahead. Brzezinski was also a rabid, fanatical anti-communist whose family background, family history had a lot to do with that. But I would argue that at least he was ideologically wed to bleeding the Soviets dry in Afghanistan more than anybody else. And for him, it wasn't just about the Vietnam syndrome. It was this rabid anti-communism that fueled his desire to do what the US did to the Soviets.
They really
Yep.
did learn. I will say that the people, I hate the people in power, whatever. They really did learn a lot from Vietnam. You know, that's why we don't see the consequences of war on the news anymore. We don't see, you know, you get to see the bombs taking off. You don't get to see when they land. You don't get to see the devastation that it causes. You don't get to see the body parts. We don't even get to see the soldiers coming home in coffins anymore. They don't show that. It's very rare. Every once in a while, you'll get like a still frame picture of Barack Obama with some coffins or something. But that's really about all that you get. And they really did learn a lot about how to, you know, kind of manipulate public opinion on war and how to, maintain support for these things. And it's no different than in WikiLeaks that they exposed how the CIA, they had different game plans for different countries. Like in France, for example, they wanted to use feminism and protecting women and children, which may sound familiar after this week, after Marianne Williamson and among others tried to use that as a reason why we shouldn't be leaving Afghanistan. So, I mean, they're very good at the propaganda game. It's really hard to overcome.
Yeah, and in the first Gulf War, the press wasn't allowed on the battlefield at all. And that was a lesson learned from Vietnam when the press was all over the place and the pictures were coming home.
Yep. All right, now, so, and I'll do this part quick because there's just no time.
Yeah, we're running. Sorry. I told you we should have done like a series.
Yeah. Well, it's all on my YouTube channel. Go check it out. But look, so if all bin Laden ever wanted, and this is again to quote his son, that they asked him, you think that your father will do any more terrorist attacks inside the United States? And he says, well, I don't see why he would. The purpose of the attacks was to get you to invade Afghanistan. As soon as you did, he's already won. I mean, man, you can't get more black and white about the truth about it than that right there out of the mouth of the son of the guy who told him himself, you know? So, but then the thing is this, if that's true and that's all he ever wanted, that's all bin Laden ever wanted, was for America to invade Afghanistan and go broke, you know, to die trying to somehow remake that country into a friendly one to American interests and so forth. Then what does that tell you about a war against the socialist infidel Saddam Hussein in Iraq that led to this massive sectarian war and the entry of thousands of new jihadists from all over the region, a whole new generation of young fighters from all over the region come fight in Iraq War II. And then when they came home to Libya and Syria, and Obama took their side, not just went after another couple of secular dictators in Gaddafi and Assad, but literally took the side of the radical Sunni bin Ladenites, the Libyan and Syrian veterans of Iraq War II who had fought on the Sunni insurgency side, on Al-Qaeda in Iraq's side against the United States. Obama took their side in Libya and then especially in Syria, which ended up leading to, and in cooperation with America's so-called allies in the region as well, which ended up leading to the rise of the Islamist Caliphate that conquered all of Eastern Syria and Western Iraq in 2013 through 17 there. And I mean, this was the wildest war propaganda of the Bush years. And this is the wildest daydreams of bin Laden hiding in his attic in Pakistan. And it was just, you know, they used to say in the Bush years, oh, the Islamic Caliphate is coming to get you, the Islamic Caliphate. Well, where is it? It's all nation states in the way. And they're all run by military dictatorships and royals in white robes. And so where's the caliphate? And then the answer was, well, Bush gave him Western Iraq, and then Obama gave him Eastern Syria. And they turned it, this guy Baghdadi might as well have been Osama bin Laden himself up there on the balcony declaring the caliphate and all this. And then they've done the same thing in Yemen. Oh, and that led, of course, to Iraq War III and all of the chaos from that. Another 500,000 people killed or so. And then they're doing the same thing in Yemen, where a Shiite group came to power at the end of 2014, beginning of 2015. And Obama's government originally was helping them kill Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula as of January 2015. But then in March, he turned around and stabbed them in the back and took Al-Qaeda's side against them. And these are the guys who bombed the Cole, who helped coordinate the September 11th attack, who tried to blow up the plane over Detroit on Christmas Day 2009, who did the Charlie Hebdo attack and the other attacks in France. And
the Manchester bombing, the Ariana
no,
Grande
Manchester was a Libyan.
Oh,
But
right, but he was financed by MI6, and they gave him a passport to travel back and forth from the UK.
But that wasn't
to Libya.
AQAP though. But
Right.
anyway, so they took their side in Yemen to this day. And in fact, to this day, they're also protecting AQAP in Syria as well. In the Idlib province, they're under the protection of the Turks and the Americans there. And so now, the great humorist Jeff Huber wrote this piece in 2011 called Osama bin Laden, Dead and Loving It. And, it's a takeoff on the Leslie Nielsen vampire or Dracula movie, which is really bad. But anyway, and I love Leslie Nielsen.
I do too.
So he says, something like, eat your heart out, Charlemagne, et tu, Julius Caesar, and how do you like them apples, Alexander? Because here is the greatest general in world history, Osama bin Laden, hiding in the attic, even from his old lady up there, directing the greatest armies in the history of mankind, hither and yon, thousands of miles, wherever he wants them to go, in what he calls into these goat rope exercises of just total waste and destructiveness. And what do we get out of any of it? Nothing. We lose. They get, and you can go back not just to Jeff Huber, the humorist, but go back to Michael Scheuer, the former chief of the CIA's Bin Laden unit, where he explains Bin Laden was trying to first bog down and bankrupt, bleed dry and force America out the long way and the hard way, first and foremost. But he also wanted, well, of course, he probably wanted to be the king of Saudi Arabia and see Zawahiri on the throne in Cairo, but that was never going to happen. But still, he wanted to see the overthrow of secular dictators like Hussein, Gaddafi, and Assad. And, I'm sure he would have liked to see the overthrow of Saleh in Yemen as well. And just the overall radicalization and destabilization of the entire region. And, the civilian populations across the entire Muslim world have been radicalized politically and religiously in so many ways. And all the American-backed dictators of the region have been completely discredited in the minds of their populations, even if they still hold on to power. It's now they don't get the benefit of the doubt. It's like, well, I guess Allah wanted him to be our king or whatever. They don't really feel that way about him anymore. They can tell, oh, I get it. The Americans want him to be our king, and we're stuck like this, So, and the economic destabilization, which helped lead to the Arab Spring revolutions and all of that kind of stuff. So, essentially, John Miller said, yeah, you and what army? The answer was the U.S. Army. The answer was, knock down our towers and we will turn the Middle East upside down for you. And so, like all the 9/11 truthers say, oh, no, the Al-Qaeda works for the CIA all along. Well, how about the CIA works for Al-Qaeda all along?
Right.
How about, Bush and Obama and Donald Trump, for that matter, and Joe Biden have been carrying water for Al-Qaeda and their agenda this whole century long now, which is, why I call the book Enough Already.
Yeah. No, and it's amazing that we're still going through this. It's amazing that, again, that the American public is still like willingly led into these never ending wars. It's completely against our own interests. It makes no sense whatsoever to go and attack people for peace. That's not going to make them like you. That's going to cause more terrorism and more unrest and more enemies. You're just going to create yourself more enemies. That's all you're doing. But the way that it's sold to the American people through our news media and through our elected officials and all of their henchmen, it's just sad that we can't manage to see past the bullshit anymore. I don't know how many times I say this all the time. How many times does your government get to lie you into a war before your sense of skepticism kicks in? Because it doesn't take much. I mean, we'll still at the drop of a dime give, $21 billion more to the military industrial complex. There's no, how are we going to pay for that? There's no like hand wringing or conversations about why are we spending more money on bombs when people are starving? Why? There's none of those conversations. It's just a guaranteed. We don't even have to talk about it. And I don't know what to do about that.
And so I'm sorry, because the answer to your rhetorical question is it's an unlimited number. And,
yes.
I did I guess it was just a little blog entry at antiwar.com back years ago called "They Lied Us into War," all of them, and it goes back to the War of 1812 and how every single major American war has been based on a giant load of steaming
I'll
crap.
have to check that out.
Every single one of them.
Yes.
So Scott,
Sorry.
as we wrap, I'd like to get your take on what you think about the US actually leaving Afghanistan, because based on what we're seeing as far as Biden's rhetoric with regard to ISIS-K being a threat, ISIS-K also being a mortal enemy, a sworn enemy of the Taliban, and then the explosions today at Kabul airport, which are still being investigated, I suppose you could say.
It smells fishy.
And then the US's imperial hubris, which it has never been, it's never wanted to give up easily. With all those factors, what's your take on the US actually leaving Afghanistan?
I think they've got to go. And the reality is the Taliban won the war. And they've never changed their position the whole time, which is get the hell out. That's it. All combat troops out of our country, period. So a small, detachment of Marines to guard an embassy or just like anywhere else in the world would be one thing. But combat troops in their country, they've never been willing to give in on this 1 inch this whole time. And I don't think they're going to. And
sadly, I just think it might end up privatized. There might just end up being a whole bunch of CIA spooks and drone attacks.
Yeah, but where are you going to put them? Right. I mean,
Right.
CIA spies got to hide with diplomatic immunity at the embassy. They have to be there essentially, with the acquiescence of the sovereign government there. And they can try to embed with rebels out, somewhere, like say if northern provinces somehow successfully try to break away from the Taliban and fight a mini war, you could have the Americans embed in there or something like that. But my bigger worry is, well, see, here's the other thing. The reason that they say, and because this is all not underground stuff. I mean, this is on the front page of the New York Times. We want to leave JSOC. We want to leave CIA. We want to leave air power. We want to stay in all these ways, right? That's front page above the fold, official. That's Biden saying, don't worry. We're not withdrawing all the way, right?
Over the horizon capabilities.
Right.
Yes.
But here's the thing. So the premise of that is that there's Al-Qaeda guys there to kill, but there's not. That's essentially all a hoax. And there hadn't been Al-Qaeda guys there in forever. And when even like the most informed hawks say, yeah, no, there are too, the best they can do is say, oh, go read the UN reports. UN reports. Like, isn't that suspicious right now? It's like saying, oh, no, because there's this House committee report. Oh, really, huh? Yeah, I'm so impressed by that. A UN report says so. Then you go read the UN report, and the UN report says, well, we're told by member governments. And that's it. They don't even give you an anecdote. They don't even tell you, well, there were some Al-Qaeda guys found in this district, in this province at this time, according to member governments. Just Al-Qaeda is still somewhere in the country, according to member governments.
It's the anonymous sources.
Nothing.
Bullshit.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anonymous source with not even a specific claim to be refuted. Right. Just nonsense. Just hot air is all they got. And if you read Reuters, the military will claim to Reuters, well, there's some members of Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. What? In other words, Pakistanis fighting over Kashmir, right? It has nothing to do with our war in Afghanistan, and it's certainly nothing to do with some intercontinental Arab terrorist war against the United States. And give me a break. And these people are absolutely grasping at straws there. So what do they need that power there to accomplish? If they're worried about ISIS, as you say, the ISIS-K, all they got to do is sit back and watch the Taliban kill them. The Taliban's been doing nothing but kill those guys forever. And now that they control the whole country, they'll have an even easier time of it.
Right.
And so that's really not a problem. And anybody saying, McMaster was saying, oh, no, the ISIS is just a front for the Taliban, a convenient. Yeah, H.R. McMaster is a war criminal and a liar. And so you can, take that and throw it right in the wastebasket. It means nothing. And these guys have brutal, absolute vendettas against each other going back for, 6-7 years. They've been cutting each other's heads off and blowing each other up. And in fact, a year ago, last August, and you might need this for debunking your friends on Facebook later or whatever. Last August, the Washington Post ran a piece called, I forgot what it's called. I do have it right here, don't I? Hang on. Our Secret Taliban Air Force. Inside the clandestine U.S. campaign to help our longtime enemy defeat ISIS. And that's in the Washington Post from last October. And it's by Wesley Morgan, the author of this new book, The Hardest Place, about the war in the Petch Valley there. And if you go to my Twitter feed, you can click and get past the Washington Post paywall with the archive.is link there. I got it there for you.
Cool.
And so that was a JSOC task force flying drones as air cover for the Taliban as the Taliban are killing ISIS guys on the ground last October. So if the Taliban thinks that they really need JSOC to stay to help them, I'd be really surprised, right? Like, but that would be the excuse. Well, we have to stay for counterterrorism and anti-terrorism. I don't know. The Taliban seem to have it in hand. And aren't asking for help, are asking only for withdrawal.
Well,
that's my big thing. We're not invited. Get out.
William Burns, the head of the CIA, recently met with the Taliban, and it hasn't been disclosed the details of that meeting, but there's a lot to be said for that meeting actually happening. So, or a lot to speculate on, at least.
Yeah, look, the Taliban clearly have a PR campaign right now that says, listen, we're really reasonable. We're not cavemen. We're 21st century Taliban, and we understand politics. Hey, they all have smartphones. It's not 20 years ago, right? I mean, things have changed. And so, I have an acquaintance who was saying she's really worried about getting her friends out of, this is right as Kabul's falling, a week and a half ago or a week ago, whatever. And I said, I think the Taliban are going to be more clever than cruel this time, which is not to say that they're good dudes, because they really are barbarians, and they have fought a horrific suicide bombing campaign and everything else for the last 20 years, man. Screw them. But the idea, the point being just that doesn't make them irrational just because they're ruthless. You know what I mean? That just means that, well, they're politicians, they're ruthless. But
yeah.
But here's our brain. We just took over this whole country with the snap of a fingers, at the whole world looking at us, every sovereign government in the world looking at us. What are we going to do? Start blowing up Buddhas and stoning women to death in the town square right now? Start sniping foreign government's personnel as they try to leave? There's no point in doing that. That's just stupid to do that, Right. So like when you mentioned the suicide attack at the gate today, that almost certainly was ISIS. And doing what? Trying to drive a wedge between the United States and the Taliban, right? Trying to break down our relations there.
Yeah. Was it a suicide attack?
It was two.
Yeah.
2 suicide.
I knew there was, I haven't been able to look at, I just saw it come up as we were getting. Okay.
Yeah. And I saw some ugly footage of bodies missing parts, man. It was really ugly. Yeah. But there's no way that was the Taliban. Okay. No. There's a 0.1% chance that was the Taliban. But that wasn't the Taliban that did that. That was somebody trying to ruin this. When what we have is a ceasefire. What we have had, and I don't know who died in this. I'll tell you what, AP originally said that 3 Americans were dead, and then they took that part down. So I don't know if that's really true or not. I saw a tweet that somebody said that Israeli intelligence was saying that. So I don't know whether they were leaking the story earlier, or if they were making that up or what, but
I'm seeing here, it's early. So there's going to be a crap ton of misinformation and just people trying to like put stuff out. One person is saying that 10 US service members were killed. Kayleigh McEnany is saying that 4 Marines have been killed. 10 American service members. That's from the Daily Caller.
Evidently, a bunch of Taliban guards were at least wounded in the thing too, or that was what the Taliban were at least claiming, was that their guards were wounded in the thing, which I believe it. I don't think for a minute it was the Taliban that did this.
What's suspicious too is that yesterday Americans were given a directive essentially to stay away from the airport, and specifically the Abbey Gate, where at least one of these explosions happened, one of these bombings happened.
Yeah, no, they said they had intelligence, I think going back 2 days, saying that there's a threat that ISIS is going to try to set off a bomb, near the airport. And so
Yeah,
everybody was
I don't
after
think this
that.
is the Taliban. This would be really silly. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
It's like the gas attacks in Syria. You know, Assad's winning and he's going to gas his
Yeah.
own people. Come on. That's just not going to happen.
I mean, you could have, you know, the agent actor problem, whatever they call it, or what's called
Agent
the commander
provocateur.
agent.
Is that what
Yeah,
you
where you know you order your guys to act cool, but then they don't because they don't
Yeah.
feel like it. You know
right?
what I mean?
Somebody's having a bad day.
Yeah, so you could have that where somebody says, you know what, these people killed my mom and dad. I don't give a damn what my commander says. I'm doing something stupid right now. You know, I don't know. We don't know.
Yeah,
but in
that's
terms
fair.
of
That's fair.
yeah, organizational capability and all that, you know, behind something like this, it's pretty clear it's somebody trying to, you know, cause a screw up.
Yes.
And you know, shame on all the right wingers, especially going, okay, well, that does. I guess we got to, you know, break the ceasefire and reinvade the country and send in thousands of troops and all this. And what are you going to do? You're going to kick the Taliban back out of power? You know, it's going to take a lot of infantry to take back over Kabul, man.
Right.
Well, a lot of them are going to die in that. And then what?
I think
we have to be
skeptical, though.
Huh?
I think we have to be skeptical, though, as to who is really behind these suicide bombings, because are we going to sit back and believe that the US didn't have intelligence that this was going to happen and intelligence they could act on that this was going to happen? Because we've been hearing about ISIS threats and ISIS-K for
like you say, they gave plenty of warning. You know, they seem to be worried about it rather than just setting up for a narrative here. You know,
I'm not saying that that's the case, but I think
look, it's hard to get a suicide bomber to do a suicide bombing that he doesn't want to do. You know what I mean? You got to be pretty much recruited by somebody that you know and trust for something like that. So it's pretty.
It'll be interesting to see how it unfolds today.
And look, ISIS originally was essentially under the influence of the Kabul intelligence agencies, which are, you know, essentially is the offshoot of the CIA, under the control of the CIA. So they bear a lot of responsibility for the origin of this thing. But I guess I'd be surprised if you had any foreign intelligence agencies behind this.
We shall see over the next coming days. It's going to be interesting. There's definitely, I think
they've got virtually all the Americans out, right? There are very few Americans left to get out of the country. Up until now, at least, no Americans had been killed, and the Taliban were respecting the ceasefire and letting everybody get safely to the airport and get out of the country. So,
it looks like rumblings are ISIS-K.
Yeah, and they can stick to the deadline. They still got time. It's only the 26th. How many days in August? I always forget that.
31.
So they got time.
Yeah.
Should be right.
Such a mess. Anyways, I know we've gone over time. I appreciate you being so generous with your time. Do you want to tell everybody, obviously, where they can find the book, antiwar.com, all that stuff, so everybody can find you when they want to check everything out?
All right. So I'm the host of the Scott Horton Show and Anti-War Radio on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA. And I got 5,580 something interviews for you there at scotthorton.org and at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, which published my books. You can see them over my shoulder there if you're watching this on video later. Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And also The Great Ron Paul. That's transcripts of about 30 interviews that I did with Dr. Paul from 2004 to 2019, if you like that kind of thing. And then I'm the editorial director of antiwar.com. And you can follow me on Twitter at Scott Horton Show. And I think that's it.
And Great. Scott's also going to be a speaker at the End the Damn Wars protests on September 11th, I think.
Correct.
Right? So that's going to be awesome. Everybody, if you're in the DC area or if you can make the trip out, definitely make the trip out. It's going to be.
Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, we're going to try to make a big deal out of that.
We need to revamp the anti-war movement in this country. It has been beaten into a pulp and we need to revitalize it. It's necessary. So I appreciate you coming to speak at that for sure. So again, thank you for your time. Yeah, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us, and hopefully we'll be able to have you back on soon so we can dive deeper into some of this madness.
Absolutely. Happy to do it anytime. Great to meet you both.
Yes, you too. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for watching. We'll catch you next time.